Alright, so, before we get started, I want all you guys to go down in the comments and thank a commenter by the name of Cyanide Nightshade for being the reason why I'm making 2 theories on the Owl House now instead of just 1. And unfortunately for all you guys who've been waiting for the King theory, it's going to have to be the second one at this point. So go ahead, go down there and thank Cyanide Nightshade for being almost exclusively the reason why this is happening. And I mean that genuinely. I haven't been this excited to make consecutive interconnected theories in a long time. And it was because of a conversation I had with this person in the comments that this is happening now. Almost entirely. Like, I still think I enjoy Amphibia more overall as a show than I do The Owl House. But rewatching this show, especially recently, rewatching so many episodes at once, and getting to the best couple episodes of the show, I am really loving this show again. And I want to talk about its lore. I've been reading about its lore. And thankfully, this episode opens with lore. Quite literally, in fact. It opens with a lore book with lore in it. And we get to read the passages in it, at least for the most part. Some of them are smudged out with like mud or something. But still, I will say right out the gate, though, this episode, Young Blood, Old Souls, is not as good as the last one, which is a little bit of a bummer. As strong a setup episode for this one as Agony of a Witch was, I would hope that this episode would be exactly as good as it, if not better, and it's just not. It's still really good, but that episode was like peak. This one isn't. Like, I won't say that there is nothing in this episode that isn't surprising given what happened in the last, but for the most part, this episode just paid off the stuff that was set up in the last episode. In fact, the only real mystery, I think, that carried over from the last episode into this one, that I didn't have some idea as to how it would be resolved, was the mystery of how Ida would recover from the curse. And this episode gives us the answer to that pretty early in its run. The revelation that Bellows only wanted Ida so that he could try to secure the portal door from her is interesting. But considering he's been talking about some major plan that he has, something about unifying something with something else, a lot of people, myself included, were already assuming that that's what he wanted, even before that reveal happened. Literally, in my opinion at least, the only lingering question going into this episode was, what will happen to Ida? How will she recover from this time? And the episode answers that before it happens. It also starts out exactly as you would expect it to. King is doing the King thing, where he's researching lore, because it's easy to forget considering the kind of character he is otherwise, but King is a history nerd. Like, he's a biology nerd too, because he is really into the biology of demons, but in any fantasy setting, demonic creatures like that, their nature is inherently linked with the lore of the world. So it makes sense he'd be into the lore of the world too, and have a book that's I think it was called like an unofficial history of the Boiling Isles or something, which gives a more objective, and I would at least hope, more honest reading of Bellows' rise to power and his reign. And it's super interesting because it does give us some new information. Like, according to the book, there was definitely a chaotic dark period that occurred immediately before Bellows took control, during which he campaigned for a more organized system. It wasn't until that campaigning failed that he rose up and took over seemingly by force, and that tells me that my theory that there was some other ruling group immediately before Bellows rose to power that he seized power from isn't true. But it doesn't mean there never was one. In fact, it could have been the loss of that ruling group that caused the Isles to descend into chaos in the first place. But yeah, we're given this lore. It's given to us as exposition from a source that makes sense, right? Setting up the episode a little bit better. And then immediately after that, Luce decides she has to go and save Ida. And King is reluctant because he's king. He's like Ida. He knows how messed up this world is, but he's not the hero type. He's not someone who's used to risking his life for other people. But this is Ida, and Luce is going to go with or without him, and he cares about both of them, so he decides to go too. And at the very least, Luce is armed with that cloak that Ida made for her. She had finished it prior to Luce returning home at the end of the previous episode. It's about at this point that we see Bellows arrive to look over his prize, a captive Ida, in her albeast form, of course, still. And first of all, he's able to not fix her completely, but make it so that she can remain cognizant in her albeast form, which is very helpful for the flow of the rest of the episode. But he also confirms that he was never going to cure her. He doesn't explicitly say that he can't, just that she's a wild witch. And wild witches don't deserve that kind of consideration. And it's interesting how blasé about it he is, because it's clear that he doesn't expect that Lilith will betray him as a result of this. So now I'm questioning exactly how much he was holding this over her head to keep her in line. Did he just not realize how tenuous his hold over her was? It's very interesting. I would really love to see more indications of what their relationship was prior to this. And we may get something like that through like a flashback later. I don't know. I hope so. Because of course Lilith does betray the Emperor for her sister. I mentioned in the previous review that it's pretty obvious that one of the major reasons why she's stuck around this long with him in the coven is because she was holding out hope that he would do as he promised and save Ida from this thing that she blames herself for. It makes perfect sense to me that if she would hold out that long in an attempt to help Ida, she would also betray this guy to help Ida. And so even though Luce is shown to blame Lilith for this, rightfully so, because she is the one who literally cursed Ida with the curse in the first place, I'm glad that once the two confront each other, ending up through the portal door, because of circumstances I'll talk about in a second, they do come to a sort of understanding. Because Luce does make it. Ida is going to be petrified by a petrification spell at the Conformatorium, that place we visited in the first episode. She overhears this on not a TV, but like a crystal ball or whatever. And so she goes there. She gets there in a very hilarious way, too, which felt kind of like the old tone of the show, trying desperately to break through into this new version of the show. It was almost sad, and yet still hilarious. She and King stepped on some grass in front of one of the Conformatorium guards and got taken in. It was absolutely hilarious. But she does make it inside, and she's handling herself pretty well. But when she gets to Ida recognizes that there's not really much they can do at this point. That it's not worth the risk. And if Lilith hadn't come on board, I would totally agree with her. So she hands over the portal door key, and therefore the portal door, to Luce, opens it up and says, "Go home. It's time. You need to go home now. You need to get away from this as fast as you can." But she does at least tell Luce to destroy the door. And so Luce now knows that Bellows wants it, and that it's a bad thing for him to get it, even if she doesn't know why. Ida is then lifted up to the stage where she's going to be petrified. It's at that point that Lilith comes in, having planned to save Ida herself. She just got there too late. The two of them scuffle. They end up in the human world, and that's where we find out that, predictably so, Luce's magic doesn't work there, since her magic comes from the Titan, and the Titan doesn't exist on Earth. But Lilith can still do magic there, so she restrains King and Luce, and they talk. And we hear her whole backstory and why she cursed Ida in the first place. We learn that it was because there was only one spot left in the Emperor's Coven, and they both wanted to go to the Coven together. That was a whole thing for a while when they were kids, because they were best friends back then. So of course they were. They're siblings who are very similar people with similar interests. And so knowing that she would lose to Ida, who, despite being younger, is better at this stuff than she is, she cursed Ida, thinking that the curse would only apply for a single day and would just take her magic. That it wouldn't, like, do something else horrible to her on top of it. And this is where we get, like, the one real genuine twist to the episode, I think. We see that she didn't have to do it in the first place, because Ida never intended to fight her. That's when Ida makes the choice to be a wild witch and shirk the whole coven thing. She doesn't want to fight her sister over this because, from her perspective, that's stupid. But she wants her sister to be happy, so she steps down and makes this reckless choice that shapes the rest of her life. It's a very loose kind of thing to do, actually. Being that reckless for another person, I understand so much better after rewatching this with the full context of the show fresh in my mind, why she took to loose as fast as she did. They really are very much alike. And yet I don't think that Ida would have remained so opposed to joining a coven after that, if that hadn't been when she had transformed into the Owl Beast for the first time, being labeled the Owl Lady and partially ostracized from society. From that point forward, I think that gave her the extra kick she needed to never conform ever again after that point. Because otherwise, as stubborn as she is even, I can't imagine her going from being so gung-ho about the coven system to not wanting to be a part of it at all. Like, couldn't she have reapplied for the Emperor's Coven later? If that had been a thing that she cared about so much? Like, you have to imagine more positions are going to open eventually, right? It really does feel like she was just making a big show to justify why she wasn't going to fight today, while also saving face, right? Oh, also, fun fact, if you look in the background in the scene, Amity's parents are totally in the stands, which makes sense. It makes sense that they would have gone to school with Ida, but, like, for some reason I didn't expect them to be there. This is supposed to be like her classmates here, right? It's also during this explanation period from Lilith where we see Chekhov's spell, the solution to Ida's curse, that's going to come into play later, but I'll talk about that when we get to it. So now it's Luce and Lilith and King who are teamed up to try to save Ida. Still doesn't go super well, though, because before they can really do anything, Bellows shows up. He captures King and Lilith immediately and tosses them in the cage with Ida. So now they're going to get petrified too. Wow, that's just fantastic, isn't it? But he's not so immediately harsh to Luce because she has the key he needs to gain control of the portal door, which she, of course, refuses to give to him. And the two of them do clash for a little bit, and she just doesn't stand a chance. What's super interesting about this, though, and this is going to tie into the first of those two theories I talked about earlier, the room that they find him in is another throne room in the Conformatorium, which is just so weird to me. Because, like, you know, maybe he has throne rooms in various structures throughout his kingdom in case he visits those regions, right? But this is nothing like his palace throne room at all. It has a completely different aesthetic to it. And brief spoiler for the first of those two theories, I guess. I'll just get it out of the way here. I think this is the throne room for the ruler that came before him. And I think we're going to learn more about this room in Season 2. I'm going to have to go back and recheck it because I haven't looked at it yet. I probably should have before I made this video on account of I'm probably humiliating myself right now. But I do think it's possible, at the very least, that we saw a snippet of this room or a place associated with this room in that Season 2 trailer. Which, you know what, I can check right now. My computer's right here. Let me go check right now, see if I'm right about this. No, I don't think that's the same room after all. Looks like it's an exterior location. Similar aesthetic, though. I'm gonna have to examine this more later. Still, similar aesthetic, and yet very old looking, does suggest that, I'm looking at the statues that turn their heads and bleed from the trailer, right? Does suggest that they're from the period prior to Belos's reign, and the similar aesthetic to some of the statues in that alternate throne room does suggest a connection between that throne room and that period as well. Sorry, I know this review is very disorganized so far. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it anyway. I'm gonna eat a fruit snack now. But yeah, I think this weird, almost medieval looking room with statues lining its walls and a weird skull throne thing and like fleshy extrusions and stuff could be the throne room for the previous ruler, or a throne room for one of his lords or something, right? Which, again, spoilers for those other theories, probably. This is probably going to make it in there. I'm going to have to cut some of my ideas from these, though, even doing two of them. Belos actually translates to lord. It's not his name, it's a title. He was a lord at one point. Or at least, that's what his name suggests. Maybe this was his original throne room. Wouldn't that be interesting? Seeing him sitting on his original throne, even before we knew that he had one. But anyway, he tries to convince Luce to give him the portal door. In exchange, he says he'll send her up to the stage so that she can save Ida, because she doesn't stand a chance against him. She fights well with the resources she has. She has Ida's staff now, too. Lilith gave it back to her. But she doesn't stand a chance, and she doesn't have time to try to change that either. She's run out of time. Ida is being petrified. So she takes his deal, but she's a smart kid, so she leaves a fire rune, which she learned during Wing It with Witches, on the portal door and blows it up. And it blows up before she's even up on the stage. She's still in view of Belos. If he really cared about this, like, if this was really a true setback to him, like, it's obviously a minor setback, but, like, if this was going to set him back so much that he couldn't still enact whatever his plan is, he would have just blown her up or something right there, right? He's pissed. He's pissed that she got one up on him for the second time, because she managed to crack his mask, too. But if this were really like the end of the world to him, he would have just destroyed her. But he keeps to their deal. When she does end up saving Ida, he lets them go. Now, that is largely in part because he understands that, like, Ida's partially petrified and everything at this point, right? Whatever happens, she's not going to be a threat to him anymore. One way or another, she's powerless, literally, going forward. And, like, again, if that weren't the case, if he believed that she would be a threat to him going forward from this point, I think he would have killed her. He wouldn't have just let him go. But he does, and Lilith does something that she even admits she should have done a long time ago, because one of the other things we saw in that flashback of hers from earlier was a spell she used to use when young Ida would get hurt. A spell that lets them share the pain. And in that case, it was to share the pain of a skinned knee. It looks like the skinned knee half healed on Ida, but then Lilith took upon herself the exact same injury that Ida now has, a half-healed skinned knee. And so, of course, and we all knew this, the second we saw Lilith use that spell in the flashback, she takes half of the curse and half of the remaining petrification on herself to mostly restore Ida. But now they both face the consequences of this. Neither one of them has access to their original magic anymore. But we do see here that Ida can use the sigil magic that Luce knows. And so Luce promises to teach them. And we see at the end of the episode that, of course, Belos is rebuilding the portal door. And in fact, he's building a larger portal around it. It's very reminiscent of what we'd see in, like, Gravity Falls and stuff, which makes total sense considering the creative staff on the show. I have to wonder, though, if it's more of a reference than just a reference, right? Are we supposed to read something into this? I don't know, but it's worth thinking about. And, man, it's a cool image. And, unfortunately, I don't really have anything else to say about this episode. Once again, Luce did something reckless, but it paid off because she was smart about it. She thought things through Even though she was doing something stupidly reckless, getting in over her head, she thought things through as best she could and made the best of each situation she came to. She's a smart and capable character who, simply put, probably shouldn't be in 90% of the situations she finds herself in, and yet she's still capable of getting out of them, of handling herself well enough in those situations that she makes it out alive. I mentioned this earlier, she's very much like Ida. They're very similar people. This is exactly the kind of thing that Ida has been doing since she got out of school, is getting herself into situations that are over her head and surviving anyway. And so while she was irresponsible here, again, I do still think she was, contradictorily enough, doing the responsible thing the whole time. Lilith's turn was entirely expected, and even though she did some really terrible stuff in previous episodes, my only takeaway from her turnaround is that now we're going to get to see more Lilith, and that's exciting. I don't resent the character literally at all. And there is a scene in there that I hadn't mentioned yet where we see that at least the people local to that area of the Boiling Isles where Ida lives are supportive of her. They do chant that she should be let go rather than petrified. And that is a cool scene, don't get me wrong. But as I mentioned before, I've seen the first 2 episodes of season 2, and man, that mentality does not seem to carry over into season 2 at all. So while it was cool, I don't think it necessarily means anything yet. I think it was just there to be a blanket statement by the show that at least the majority of people most of the time don't condone this kind of behavior from their ruler. That the people are better than him, if that makes sense. And I like how Ride or Die Willow and Gus are for loose. And straight up, I think Amity would have been right there at their sides if her legs still weren't injured from Wing It with Witches. That was cool, but again, nothing that happens in this episode was really unexpected to me at all. This is all payoff, just like Enchanting Gromfright was mostly all spectacle. This episode is mostly all payoff, and again, there is nothing wrong with that. Just like there was nothing wrong with the mostly all spectacle of Gromfright, there's nothing wrong with this episode being mostly all payoff. It's just that after having gone over the plot of the episode, I don't have much else to say. It's very good. This episode looks fantastic, and it was really cool that the climax of the season happens at the Conformatorium, putting some nice bookends on the season as a whole. But there's not much more to say. Agony of a Witch is the stronger episode overall, but this one is still really, really good, and it does have some substance to it, but for the most part, it's also in its own way just spectacle. I think if I really had to break down what is the most exciting thing about this episode, to me, it's that it does shake up the status quo a lot. Like, our heroes do survive this. They do get back home by the end of this episode, something that didn't happen in the previous one. But it's clear that the tone of the show has shifted. The status quo has changed, and it's not just going to go back to what it was. But you do still get the sense that the show is going to feel at least a little more like how it used to going forward. It's not going to be as dark as Agony all the time. And I like that. I liked how this season ended. All of that said, as per usual, and for the last time in Owl House Extravaganza 2021, what did you guys think of this episode if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content, subscribe. If you haven't, you can also check out links to my various social medias and all the ways you can help my channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.